Welcome to the 54th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Thomas H. Cook, Edgar Award-winning mystery author and author of many novels including Red Leaves, Master of the Delta, and The Last Talk with Lola Faye. Good. Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. Today my guest is Thomas H. Cook, the author of many acclaimed and well-reviewed mystery novels. Cook's 1996 novel, The Chatham School Affair, won an Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America. Cook's latest novel is The Quest for Anna Klein. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Anyway, we can jump into this. I was just going to mention to you, I think we have a little bit of a shared background. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, and I keep moving further and further north. I live in western Massachusetts.
Yeah, there's this book that Willie Morris wrote called North Toward Home. And if from Mississippi, you know, from Yazoo, Mississippi, and that's very much the way I felt. As a matter of fact, I mentioned that book a few weeks ago when I was at the Boston Public Library for they sort of tapped for the literary lights, and I told that very lovely crowd, how very much at home I had always felt in the North. And I moved to New York City in 1969, and I just bought a one-way ticket to New York on a plane. I didn't know a single person there, but I just had a desperate need to live there, and 1969 was not exactly a popular time to be a Southerner. That was when all of the civil rights movement was going on and all that, and I found the people of New York just unbelievably welcoming. What they expect you to do is work hard, but they didn't hold my being Southern against me.
Yeah, that was certainly my experience, because I actually lived in New York as well. I lived in New York for about 9 years, and I kind of jokingly told people that to my parents' dismay, I keep moving further and further north. But that was my experience too. I literally, and I tell this story, and people can't believe it, but I had never stepped foot in New York City until I drove through the tunnel in a moving van.
Did you at least have an apartment?
I did have an apartment.
Actually not collected them, but there have been many I Come to New York stories over the years, and I was at the Authors Guild benefit one night in New York City, and I was seated with a fellow, and he, I think, was from North Carolina, and we were beginning to share each other's New York stories, and he said he became such an absolute irritant to his parents, always talking about New York and how he wanted to go to New York. He said one day his father just grabbed him by the shirt and more or less tossed him into the truck with a cardboard sign that says, "Take this boy to New York," and left him on the highway. And that's how he finally did get there, with a suitcase, and that was it. But I remember I didn't have any money. I'd sold my car, which is what I always say is the ultimate way a Southern boy burns his bridge behind him, and with that money, I bought that ticket. I still remember the price. It was $79 one way, and got off the plane, and I went into a taxi and said, "Just take me to a cheap hotel." And the taxi driver took me to a hotel called the Dixie, right on 42nd Street. and as Pip says in Dickens, and from there I made my way into the world. I misquoted. I think it's David Copperfield who says that. So let me quickly change that.
Sure. Well, if someone hasn't heard yet about your new novel, The Quest for Anna Klein, can you give them a sense or an idea of what the book is about and what they can expect?
Yeah, and it's a big difference for me. Big difference for me. I don't usually write standard mysteries. I don't write shoot 'em ups, and I don't write cozies, and I don't have cats or petunias or anything like that in my books. But I'd also never written a novel that really had a lot of sweep in terms of time and geography. My books have a tendency to center on family crises of one kind or another, and they're often in small towns, although I've written a couple of books that take place in New York. But this one has a tremendous sweep, I think, and it really has somewhat to do with 9/11. what happens is that in December of 2001, just a few months after the attack, a young think tank expert in Washington comes to interview an old man who has written him to say that in the current crisis, he might have something useful that might be useful to the current situation. And then begins to unfold a tale that begins in 1939 about a plot that was supposed to change the world. And from there, the story unfolds in the sense that he is asked to give his Connecticut home up to the training of a brilliant young woman named Anna Klein. During the course of the novel, he decides to go with her to Europe to carry out this plot. During the carrying out of the plot, their cyanide tablets are exchanged, and she is captured and he is captured. And so in order not to betray her, because he was afraid that he will under torture, he takes her cyanide, and it doesn't work. So he knows that was a false cyanide that she was given. And so from then on, he seeks to find her, and that takes him really throughout the world.
And I know that a lot of authors don't like the question of where you get your ideas, but I'm curious, given what you talked about in terms of the storyline from the 1930s and also tying it into September 11th, do you have a sense or remember of how the idea in terms of the basic kind of background or mechanics of the plot came to you?
With Anna Klein, I don't actually remember what caused me to do that, although it just felt really comfortable to do something entirely different and on a much larger scale, and it moves a little faster than some of my other novels do. At other times, though, I have a very vivid memory of what caused it. I know that my wife and I live part-time on Cape Cod, and more often than not on Cape Cod, but we also have a place in New York City. But we will go down to New York, and on the Connecticut Thruway, you get off at a McDonald's, and we were getting off from McDonald's one day, and my wife just looked over the road sign and said, "Look at that, that'll interest you." And the road sign said Breakheart Hill. And I remember having very much of that book in my head by the time we got to New York, about an hour and a half, 2 hours later. Those words had just completely triggered something. In another one, I was in the Metropolitan, I was in the MoMA, actually. No, actually, I was in the Metropolitan Museum, Metropolitan Museum, and not the Modern Art. And I saw a painting, and it just absolutely a novel came right out of it. And I have no explanation for that whatsoever. It just happens. But now, when I'm at a loss for what to write, I'll often go to an art museum and look at paintings and see if anything really, really inspires me.
As you mentioned earlier, you've published many mystery novels. What appeals to you about kind of the mystery form?
The mystery form doesn't really appeal to me very much at all. I don't, for the most part, read what are classically called mysteries. I don't read cozies normally. But I do like to write about people in crisis. And usually some sort of crime is always about people in crisis, causes a crisis. But my books are really about moral crisis more than physical crisis. There's usually, nobody's chasing anybody down a dark alley or there's no gunfire really. As I always say, when I write about sex, the camera lifts toward the tree, so there's not a lot of that. It really is usually very intense moral dramas that I write about. And I'm not so sure they would always be classified as mysteries had I not been nominated for an Edgar Award first time out. The very first book I wrote was nominated for an Edgar. And after that, and it was very much a mystery. Let's not quibble about that. It was very much a mystery. I didn't know that, but once I began to read mysteries, I thought, oh, yeah, that book was very much a neat little police procedural. But I had never read a police procedural, and so now I say that I invented the form. but in fact, it follows pretty much the way a police procedural would work. And so anyway, that was nominated for an Edgar. And even though my next novel was not a mystery, and the novel directly one after that was, and the next one was not, you were pretty much a mystery novelist after that. And certainly I have written quite a few books that are absolutely mysteries, detective novels and that sort of thing.
And I know from reading your novels that you spend a lot of time in terms of the characterization and much more depth and exploration than as you've outlined a typical mystery is. Why do you think more authors in the typical mystery genre don't follow your path to kind of exploring the deep emotional impact around a crime?
Well, let's face it, they don't sell as well. To write with more character and more atmosphere and more depth has a tendency to slow the novel down. It's not it's not gunplay and a twist around every corner. And the fact of the matter is that books that do move at a much quicker pace, even though they're not necessarily about anything, they do have a tendency to do better. I wish that weren't the case. I wish that you could sell lots and lots of books with added character and atmosphere. But the fact of the matter is, it's just not so. The mystery reading community is highly demarcated in my view. I mean, there are people who like what I do, and then there are people who like. And they would not necessarily read, say, a cozy. That's not completely true, but it certainly comes close to being true. And so people who read cozies usually don't read PI novels, or they don't read techno thrillers. And so that audience is highly defined. And when you write a series of standalones, as I have for the last 25 years, it's very difficult to have an audience because you don't have a continuing character. You don't have one continuing location. And people, I think, readers by and large, like the familiarity of having a character that whom they have come to know and in whose life they're involved. And when you do a series of books, all of which are quite different, I always say I put a bullet in the head of my audience every time I write a new book.
But obviously for you as a writer, that that path that you've taken is one that interests you versus versus writing a series mystery where you do come back to a familiar group of people or setting.
That's true, and for me, I mean, I did write a series. I mean, I wanted to be successful and to make a living as a writer, and so I tried that form. I wrote 3 novels about the same character, in more or less the same setting, and the last 2 were New York City, and then the first one he moved to New York City. So New York City really is the locale. But when I finished the 3rd book, I said to my wife, if I ever write a book worse than this, I'm going to stop. And because I just didn't like it, I felt as though I had lost the energy for it, and just simply didn't want to do it anymore. Now, that said, I have many friends who write series characters, and they bring a freshness to it every time. They like being with those characters. They know their readers like being with those characters. And I'm really quick to say, and I do mean this sincerely, that's very much to their credit. I mean, it's very much to the entertainment of their readers, and they really like it, and that's what they do. Writers shouldn't be the same. We really do need plenty of different flavors in the ice cream store and in the bookstore too.
You mentioned earlier about your first novel that you felt was kind of characterized as a police procedural, and it was nominated for an Edgar Award. And you said that at that time you had not read much in the mystery genre. What type of literature and books were you reading when you started writing that first novel?
Well, I grew up in the Southern school system. I graduated high school in 1965, and the Southern public school system, as I'm sure you know, you're a Southern boy too, they did not give a nod to modernity. They were not interested in popular literature. They never assigned it. We read nothing but the classics. We read Dickens, we read Shakespeare, and we read pretty much nothing else. So we read some Hemingway and some Faulkner and some Fitzgerald. Of course, that throw in some James Fenimore Cooper, who's just unreadable as far as I could tell. I mean, but we read, things like Moby Dick as well. And so that's what I read. That's what I grew up reading, which was, now sort of thought of as serious, serious literature. But from that, I got a sense of the deep character, and then when I went on in college, we mostly read Conrad, for example, and then on to the Russian authors, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, those kinds of writers. And so I was brought up on just sort of classic, so-called great literature, and I really never really lost a taste for it. So that tends to be what I read, which is now we think of as something called mainstream fiction. But I also read a lot of nonfiction. I'm doing a travel book on traveling to the saddest places on Earth, and writing about the value of visiting these places. And because of that, I've also been reading a lot of nonfiction in order to research the places before I go there.
And what are some of the places that you're visiting for that book that you're writing?
Well, I'm going to the Door of No Return next October, but in recent the recent couple of years during which I'm doing this for my British publisher, and in the recent couple of years I've gone to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki, to the leper colony of Kalapalpa, which Robert Louis Stevenson called the saddest place on earth. We've gone to Verdun. I went to the castle ruin of the world's first serial killer, Gilles de Rais, in Machecoul, France. Nouakchott in Georgia, which is where the Trail of Tears began. Those kinds of places.
When you wrote that first book, if I'm not mistaken, you at the time were the book reviewer and teaching English in Atlanta, or you were the book reviewer for Atlanta Magazine and you were teaching English. Is that correct?
That's right. I was an adjunct teacher, which means you had no benefits and hardly any salary, but you'd be teaching. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was pretty much they were adults, and so they were people who really loved the fact that they were in college and were really there trying to learn. So yes, that's right. I was the book reviewer for Atlanta Magazine, and in little bio after bio, they say I was a book reviewer for Atlantic Magazine, and that was never the case. I wish.
Atlanta. And so what was the process like for you when you wrote that first novel? Had you tried to write a novel before?
No, I hadn't. I suppose some part of me always wanted to write novels, but I had never really seriously considered it as a career. I was continuing graduate school. I ended up at Columbia University in New York, and after completing my PhD orals, I went down to Atlanta as my base because I had lived there before, and in fact graduated undergraduate school there. And so that was a place I knew, and I thought I could get work and maybe some teaching. But I was going to do a biography of the khaki governor of Alabama, Big Jim Folsom, for my PhD dissertation. And what happened really was that I got a job at Coca-Cola. I was a temp, and it wasn't really at Coca-Cola, but the temp service sent me over to Coca-Cola, and I arrived there, I think pretty much the day that saccharin was declared to be a carcinogen. And so they were making a lot of money with a drink called Tab, and they were very upset by this fact, and it was going to really hurt their sales. And so I got there that morning, and they put me in a room with a Selectric typewriter, which was the top of technology at that time, with a little correctable tape on it, and next to a phone. And I sat there for a while. No one ever gave me anything to do, so I took a sheet of paper and I started a novel. And after that, I looked busy, and so that phone never rang, and no one ever gave me anything to do for the next 6 weeks. And so I wrote this book, and that's a true story.
That's a great story. I actually had some temp jobs where I sat and wrote short stories myself, so I
Yep.
can totally relate to that. That's great. Well, do you remember what the process was like for you in terms of getting that novel published? Did you have trouble finding an agent, or was it, an easy process for you?
Well, it was an unusual process because I didn't have an agent and I didn't know anybody who had an agent. I didn't know any other writers at all. I knew one person who was the girlfriend of a friend of mine at Columbia, and out of college, she had gotten a job at Playboy Press, pretty low on the editorial level. But I knew that she would read it, and so I sent it to her, and she did read it, and she liked it, and she gave it to the next editor up, and that editor liked it. And so it was without being agented. Now, this, I have to say, this would not happen today because they do not read unsolicited manuscripts anymore. So this story, particularly when I tell it to young aspiring writers, I tell them, this is not going to happen to you. This was a tremendous amount of luck, and it would not happen today. But she read it and gave it to the second editor. The second editor liked it, and so I was feeling pretty good about that. And then she gave it to the third editor, who was the highest on the totem pole, and he didn't like it. And so she called and said, well, I'm sorry. I'm sure this is going to be disappointed, but David, his name was David, did not like it. And so at that point, I thought it was dead. And then she went out, a few weeks later, she went out to dinner with the head of the company and his wife. And she was sitting next to the wife of the head of the company, and said, and the wife said, "Oh, what have you read anything interesting lately?" And she said, "Yeah, I sort of like this little book that by this kid from Alabama, and I liked it, and another editor liked it." And she said, but David didn't like it. And what Nancy quoted was that she says, "Well, I'm not crazy about David, so let me see let me see the book." And so she read it, and she liked it, and she gave it to her husband, who liked it, and then the book was published. And I'm quick to say that once that book went into process, this particular editor, David, did come to like it, and wrote me a lovely letter, and was very supportive of the book. So he was the kind of person that, that could change his opinion of a book, and I really appreciated that. And later, when I met the woman who had done this, I so thanked her, for taking the time to read that book, because I'm not sure I would have written another book if that had been turned down. I didn't have that particular kind of fire in my belly. I thought that I would probably end up teaching somewhere, but not be a writer.
That's interesting that you say that, because in preparation for this interview, I looked at some other interviews and did some research, and I was reading an interview with you where you explained to the interviewer that oftentimes, in terms of your writing process now, you usually start a book within a few days or a week or two of finishing another book. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is. Really, up until right now, I'm finishing up a book right now. I mean, literally finishing up. I'm in the last stages of the final edit. And for the first time in my life, and maybe that's because I'm a man of a certain age, but for the first time, I'm not sure what I'm going to write next. But that's, to my knowledge, that's the first time that's ever happened. I usually know, and I think part of the reason for that is because I keep wanting to do something even more different now. And if you were just going to do the same, just do another intense sort of moral drama, then they come around all the time. And I have many ideas for books like that. But I just want to do something bigger, and something that can breathe more deeply. And I'm not sure what that is. I am extremely proud of Anna Klein, and was very affected by it because it had all that, and I liked all that, and the history and the movement and the sweep and the sense of an historical moment that is in itself really critical, and when people are tested, and I loved it. And I would love to find another story that would allow me to do that without it being the same story.
Right, right. And so going back a moment to where you said basically if Playboy Press had not published that first novel, that you would probably not have written another one. Have you thought about what takes you from that, for the lack of a better word, a little bit of ambivalence, I guess, to a point in your life where the ideas, just come so frequently that you can go from one book to another?
Well, I know that when that book was published, your life rather changes in the sense that what had seemed like an extremely distant prospect is not anywhere near so distant anymore. For example, on the basis of having written that book, I got a wonderful New York agent who was very supportive of my career for many, many, many years. Very prestigious agent. I got noticed in a way that I'd never been noticed before by other publishers. And so I was able to move from Playboy Press, where I had a very bad experience publishing that book, or everything that happened after it was everything that happened after it was chosen to be published was bad. Everything before that was good, but everything after that was bad. So that I remember that what Mark, I've forgotten what he wrote. Mark Connolly, is it? But he said one time that writing a book in America is a miserable experience, and it certainly was for me in that book. But then Houghton Mifflin picked up the second book, which was a literary novel, and that was a wonderful experience. And it was with them for the next 3 books. And so, at that point, you just become a writer in a way. That's how you make your living. Even though I imagine I was 40 before, and I published my first book, which I think was 28 or 29. But I was 40 years old before I was able to make a living, really make a living, without anything else. Yeah.
And what has your kind of, I know it's kind of hard to encapsulate in a few sentences, but what has your experience been? I mean, because there are a lot of writers who published, when your first book was published, who certainly have not had the career that you had. What has been your experience along the way of staying published and continuing to write and have new books published?
Well, I left Houghton Mifflin of my own free will. I left Putnam after that of my own free will. I went to Bantam, and I left Bantam not of my own free will. And at that point, I honestly thought my career was over. But because publishing had changed so much, and although I had written a great many books, that was not working for me because none of those books had ever really been big hits. And they were, by that time, publishing had changed enough to where publishers were, publishing as a business, and so they were after books by either young people whom they thought could write, a hit for them, or someone who had been doing it for a long time. I wasn't in that category. And so, actually, the fact that I had written a great many books was working against me rather than for me. But Otto Penzler, my dear friend and savior, actually had made a deal with Houghton Mifflin to have his own imprimatur, and so he brought me over to Houghton Mifflin, and that became a real spur to my career. I wrote a book called Red Leaves that did very, very, very well. I've just sold the option to that to Jean-Pierre Jeunet, who did Amélie and A Very Long Engagement. So that book has had a really, really great life, and it gave my career a completely new boost. But that said, I think that writers coming into the business today are not going to have long careers. The vast majority will not. I've written a piece about that on Musings and Meanderings that I think appears on the 11th, about how we may be on the verge of no longer having a mature literature because they get rid of writers too quickly, that you're not going to have older writers if you read This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald's first novel, and you read Great Gatsby is a lot better. And if you don't allow a writer to mature, to learn his craft or her craft, and to really change his or her themes as he moves through time, then you're just simply you're not going to have a mature literature.
When you are talking to aspiring writers, what tips or advice do you give them if they are interested in trying to get their work published, whether it's short stories or novels?
Well, sadly, I think a lot of the advice has a tendency to be business advice, and none of it is very good in the sense of the news that it brings to the aspiring young writer. It's extremely difficult to get an agent, and they now have a whole tier of people you hire to get you agents to get you an agent. So there's another whole new tier of that. This is a genuine problem, because in fact you do need an agent, and you probably won't get published without one. You might be able to publish short stories without an agent, and maybe they'll be seen by an agent who will pick you up on that basis. It's possible, I suppose, that an editor could do the same, but probably less likely. So that is important to know. But you don't need to focus so much on getting an agent that you forget that you really need to write a good book. And I honestly do think, although there's an enormous amount of trash out there, that editors do seek from time to time, and maybe a lot of the time, a good book, and to try to write a good book. And for it to be heartfelt.
Well, many writers are also devoted readers as well. Are there any recent novels or nonfiction books that you've read that impressed you and that you would recommend?
Well, yeah, I liked very much The House of Sand and Fog, Andre Dubus III's book, which I recently read. I liked Leopold's Ghost as a history, the story of the Congo. Those I thought were very, very well written books, one fiction, one nonfiction. Again, those are serious novels. I generally will read anything that Robert Stone writes. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. But he's a serious writer, and I like to know what he has to say. Let's see. I've been reading so much nonfiction recently that I haven't read a novel in a while. Although I also like Olive Kitteridge, which is really a sort of a series of connected stories.
Well, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd want to mention?
Well, certainly I want to plug my book, and to say that I honestly think that The Quest for Anna Klein, could have a very wide audience, wider than the audience that I'm used to, and that I think it is a crossover book. I think a person who wants a good sort of mainstream novel would enjoy it, and someone who is interested in mysteries and espionage would enjoy it too. But I think it's a rich novel, and I think it's the richest novel it has more riches and it's more varied in its riches than my usual novel. It just has more aspects to it. The structure is interesting, I think, and I urge people to actually give a new author a chance. It's interesting. I'll tell you this one story. I was coming out of my British publisher, and they're near the British Museum, right on near Russell Square, and of course that's known for publishers. And I have white hair and a white beard, and I had a book under my arm, so I looked like a writer. And I came out and got in a cab, and so the cab driver, this is in London, of course, he says to me, "Are you a writer?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What do you write?" And I said, well, it's fiction. And he said, well, what kind of fiction? And I said, well, because I need to narrow it down. I said, I suppose you could classify them in a way as crime writers, crime novels. And he mentioned a very famous female crime writer. And he says, I just bought her 6th book. He said, boy, did the last 5 suck. So I was thinking, well, could you please give someone that you've never heard of a chance, and maybe give a guy who writes standalones rather than series books a chance, because readers very rarely do.
That's a great anecdote. Well,
so that would be my plea.
Okay. Well, again, the novel is The Quest for Anna Klein. It's available in bookstores now, and so people listening should definitely check it out. And again, we've
Thanks so much.
Sure. Again, we've been speaking with Thomas Cook. And where can they find out more information about you online, Thomas?
Well, I don't have a website. I mean, I don't have any moral qualms about them or anything like that. It's just I checked with everybody that has one. It didn't seem to be any particular reason. But really, I mean, you can just pick up various bits of bio here and there, and if that's what you're talking about. But primarily just to keep posted on book reviews and just do on various blogs and see when a book comes out, because the real trouble now is even letting those people that whom would buy your book, just letting them know that it's in the stores. It's extremely difficult.
Again, the novel is The Quest for Anna Klein, and Thomas, thanks for doing the interview.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed every minute of it.
This is Lee Child, and I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
Hear that? Is that America cheering or a sausage patty sizzling to perfection? It's time to cheer for Egg McMuffin and fresh cracked eggs at McDonald's. It's time to wake up to the aroma of freshly baked biscuits and treat yourself to a real honest-to-goodness morning meal. Breakfast, it's on at McDonald's. Now get any breakfast sandwich for just $2. Available only through the app. Mobile order and pay available at participating McDonald's. McD app download and registration required.
In South Dakota, we're looking forward to exploring new roads and wide open spaces. When you're ready to travel, go great places. Learn more at TravelSouthDakota.com.